Hello and welcome to another episode of the Federalist Files. I'm going to be covering Federalist number 7. It is titled The Same Subject Continued Concerning Dangers from Dissensions Between the States, written by Alexander Hamilton, written on November 15th, 1787. Topics covered here are going to be land disputes and debt. Throughout this paper here, Hamilton continues his argument of a union of states under one national government rather than those sovereign confederacies. He cites the fear of territorial disputes that would pervade the existence of men. Pretty much goes through a history of this. And as you can see in the last paper, it was like that as well. This paper is pretty much a continuation of the last. It kind of wraps up a lot of the ideas of the last couple papers. And then I think the next paper is going to be similar, and then we really start rolling with Federalist number 9, 10. Those are two very significant ones. So we're gonna start going. It's gonna get stronger and stronger. We're gonna learn more and more about the actual Constitution. These are just questions that are kind of being raised about the current system, the Articles of Confederation, in these last couple papers. But we're gonna see more and more. We're going to get into different articles of the Constitution and why they are there. So he states, and I quote, "Territorial disputes have at all times been found one of the most fertile sources of hostility among nations," end quote. Then he continues, and I quote, "This cause would exist among us in full force," end quote. And then he states again later, and I quote, "We have a vast tract of unsettled territory within the boundaries of the United States," end quote. Pretty much what he's saying here is that we're going to have some territorial disputes unless if we get that federal government in place with the Constitution, because we do have a lot of unsettled land, and we're going to have disputes. We've already seen some disputes, which he goes on later. I think it's Pennsylvania and I don't remember the other state, but they were fighting over Wyoming territory, but I'm going to get to that. Now, he states, and I quote, "It is well known that they have heretofore had serious and animated discussion concerning the rights to the lands which were ungranted at the time of the Revolution, and which usually went under the name of Crown lands. The states within the limit of whose colonial governments they were comprised have claimed them as their property," end quote. Here he's referring, when he says crown lands, he's referring to lands that were owned by the either the Loyalists or Great Britain. They were territories of Great Britain. And these Western territories, they were at one time owned and possessed, but then they were possessed by Great Britain through the submission of these native tribes that held the land. And then once Great Britain signed that Treaty of Peace, they relinquished those lands, and they were no longer owned by them. So they were pretty much up for grabs amongst the states. And he goes into it's called the Treaty of Peace, but it is the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Peace, it was multiple treaties which pretty much ended the Revolutionary War and gave America its sovereignty. And I have it here. And I'm going to leave the link up if you want to see the Treaty of Peace. They call it the Treaty of Paris. I prefer the Treaty of Peace because even the Treaty of Versailles, for example, I don't know why, but we name these treaties after the place in which they were signed at. But then there's multiple treaties. I mean, if you look up the Treaty of Paris, there's so many. You just know the most prominent one is the one that gave America, confirmed its independence with other countries around the world, and specifically the British. So the only article from this peace treaty, the Treaty of Peace, that is still standing today is the very first article. But some of the articles go through, like, for example, Article 3. I think it's either Article 3. Yeah, Article 3 goes through or Article 2 goes through, the land that's going to be considered, American jurisdiction, and then they go through what's going to be France, what's going to be Spain. I think Spain at the time, they owned, like, Florida. and they do this through different waters. I will be putting a chart up. I'm going to put a picture up of that, the way that geographically looks on the map after the Treaty of Peace. Now, the third article, I thought this was interesting. It was either the third or the fourth. Let me see here. Oh yeah, third article is about fishing. You know, we had the right to fish in you know, these areas that used to be British owned. And then, oh, the fifth. This is the one that I thought was interesting. The restitution of all the states' estate. I guess at this time the revolutionaries were taking land and estates that were owned by British loyalists or British subjects, people that were British citizens. They had to give that money back. They had to either give the estate back or they had to pay. Under this Treaty of Peace, they had to pay back for that estate. And that was something I thought was really, really interesting. Like I said, none of this stuff is currently still in action with the exception of the very first article. And the first article reads, and I quote, "His Britannic Majesty acknowledges the said United States, viz. New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island and Providence plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia to be free, sovereign, and independent states, that he treats with them as such, and for himself, his heirs, and successors, relinquishes all claims to the government, propriety, and territorial rights of the same in every part thereof," end quote. So this is pretty much just saying that the British king acknowledges that all those states are sovereign now, and they are no longer his property or his territory, and all of his successors or heirs to his throne will also acknowledge that as well, which is also kind of what our Constitution is. It does acknowledge to our posterity, meaning our future generations, that this is an agreement also upon them that they are to also follow. And I do like, after reading this whole thing, the way the Britannic Majesty, they say it over and over again. I'm just happy that we don't have that kind of system. And still, I mean, they do not still have that monarchical system in Great Britain, but they do still have the stupid royal family, which is just ridiculous. The fact that they're glorified by people and people look up to them in the media. The American media covers them probably more than anybody does, and everyone's so interested in everything that goes on with them. It's very, very weird. It's like worshiping these golden calf-like people that are not as if they are deities. It's very, very concerning and troubling. I'm going to continue here. Unsettled. It is known that the lands. Yeah, so this treaty was signed by, obviously, the Great Britain. The king agreed upon it. And representing the United States was Ben Franklin, John Jay, Henry Lawrence, and John Adams, which is pretty awesome. And it was voted upon by our Congress in order to pass it. You know, we didn't have that monarchy where we just had one guy decide for the entire country. We actually had that system, that representative democracy system, in place where we made decisions derived from the people. And then Hamilton goes into land disputes here, and I quote, "In the wide field of Western territory, therefore, we perceive an ample theater for hostile pretensions, without any umpire or common judge to interpose between the contending parties. To reason from the past to the future, we shall have good ground to apprehend that the sword would sometimes be appealed to as the arbiter of their differences," end quote. Here, really, what he's doing is he's giving you that analysis that, listen, you know, there's gonna be a war, we're gonna fight. The sword will really be the main determining factor whether or not this disputed land that's unclaimed will be taken by one state or the other state. That's what he's saying, and that's really what the need for that federal government structure is to make sure if something like that happened, you would have an army or military to shut it down or suppress those issues, or you can deal with it, you can handle it in court rather than a bunch of bloodshed. And then he also argues here that commerce will be, and I quote, "another fruitful source of contention," end quote. And this is going to be, he's going to go into the next part here, and this is very important. He's going to talk about, and I've talked about this in earlier papers, that some states are going to try to put tariffs or some sort of tax or imposition, duty. They're all interchangeably used throughout the papers. It all means the same thing, just a tax on their products that they're sending from one state to another because they want to give their state the upper hand and the advantage because of their own patriotism for their own state. And he states, and I quote, "We should be ready to denominate injuries those things which were in reality the justifiable acts of independent sovereignties consulting a distinct interest," end quote. So pretty much he's just saying, hey, we should be ready to have to deal with all of these issues, and because these independent sovereignties are going to do whatever they can to help themselves and their people rather than the other people in the states. And he continues this point, and I quote, "It is not at all probable that this unbridled spirit would pay much respect to those regulations of trade by which particular states might endeavor to secure exclusive benefits to their own citizens. The infraction of these regulations on one side, the efforts to prevent and repel them on the other, would naturally lead to outrages, and these to reprisals and wars," end quote. So here's what he's referencing is exactly what I was saying before, that they're going to try to secure those exclusive benefits for their own citizens, which isn't really unreasonable, because at this time it was almost like every state for themselves. There really was not a strong federal government to back anybody up. So if a state were to go into some sort of a deep debt, or the people were to become destitute and lack food or any resources that they needed, it wasn't like the federal government was going to come in and help everybody out like currently we have, welfare or food stamps or unemployment. We have all those safety net systems currently that we pay a very, very heavy amount of our federal income tax for, like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Those three alone are about 2/3 of our budget every single year in the federal government, which is such a large percentage if you really think about it, because those payroll taxes are not, and those payroll taxes you pay are not 2/3 of your actual tax burden personally from your paycheck. So that's telling me that from your federal income tax, as well as those payroll taxes that get taken out, they're actually taking a chunk of your federal income tax and they're using it to pay for those social programs. So 2/3 of every, of all taxes federally, which include those payroll taxes and the federal income withholding tax, go alone just to those social programs. That doesn't even have to do with our military. That doesn't have to do with our hiring, like, our law enforcement agencies, or we have all these really, really weird federal government programs and different systems and jobs that a lot of them I'm sure are very, very just useless, and we don't really need them. But they're there. The bureaucracy increases its size. It just gets bigger and bigger. And that's really what they had that whole Tea Party movement before Trump was elected for, was to cut down on the bureaucracy and the outrageous spending. And if we can somehow cut on that spending, or at least just hold it at a standstill, if you can thwart that spending, curtail it, just keep it at, let's say, $4 trillion, which it was at. I don't even know what it's at now. I mean, all the stimulus packages that were passed through, I can only imagine what the debt ceiling's at this point. If you could find a way to somehow just cut that spending and just allow the economy to flourish as it's been, with the GDP increasing every single year around 2 to 3%, then you'll be able to pay that debt off eventually. As long as you can curtail the spending, you'll bring in the revenue through taxation in order to pay off those debts. And a reforming of those social programs is also very necessary. It's been necessary for a long time now at this point, and it just seems like each administration that runs says they're going to reform it, and then it just never gets reformed. Especially, I mean, I will say that about the Trump administration is one thing. He did not actually run on a reformation of those social programs. Everybody else pretty much did, though, that ran in the nomination. And even some Democrats have said that they would do it, and they never got it. Just no one ever gets it done. Everyone says they're going to do it, or they make it like they're going to cut spending, which would you would be able to draw the inference upon that statement alone that they would try to fix those systems. But it seems like no one has fixed those systems. and that's a problem. And I'm gonna go on to explain this too. They also have a lot of this paper is written on the debt and how that's going to also cause a lot of infighting and factions. But at this time, individual states didn't have this backup fund from the federal government, so they were really on their own. So it did make sense. It was almost like an every state for itself kind of deal. It made sense that they would try to force higher impositions and taxation on certain states rather than others if they knew that their goods would still sell there. And he continues here. Oh yeah, this is the point that he was trying to make here, is that each separate confederacy will have its own commercial policy peculiar to itself, and that would also hinder the progression of commerce in the country. It'll be harder for us to get bigger and bigger when it's confusing about the taxation and the duties from one state to another. Like New Jersey can take advantage of New York, because New Jersey at this time was a lot of farmland. New Jersey can charge New York, a 10% taxation or tariff on whatever it is that they're sending there, and then meanwhile they can turn around and only charge Pennsylvania 5% because they know Pennsylvania wouldn't buy at that 10% rate, because let's say they had their own farms where they were growing their own tomatoes or something like that. And if states were to regulate that interstate duties or taxes, then they would be taking advantage, and they would hold power and overcharge specific states, which is what I just said. And here he continues, and I quote, "The public debt of the Union would be a further cause of collision between the separate states or confederacies," end quote. And this is a huge part of the very end of this paper here. It's about a page or page and a half, and he talks about the debt, and he states, and I quote, "There are even dissimilar views among the states as to the general principle of discharging the public debt. Some of them either less impressed with the importance of national credit, or because their citizens have little, if any, immediate interest in the question, feel an indifference, if not a repugnance, to the payment of the domestic debt at any rate," end quote. So he's just saying that there really isn't even an agreement amongst the states what the actual payments should be to try to get rid of this debt, and there was a very, very large debt ceiling at this point in the magnitude of the amount of commerce that was going on in these states and how big the country was, because at this time the country was not as large and didn't have that kind of apparatus where it was possible to really tax and collect that money to pay that debt off. And he continues here, and I quote, "The citizens of the states interested would clamor, foreign powers would urge for the satisfaction of their just demands, and the peace of the states would be hazarded to the double contingency of external invasion and internal contention," end quote. Here what he's really alluding to is that, like I said in before videos, is that a lot of these states would end up going to foreign powers because they would not be able to pay this off, and which would be a huge issue, because then that would invite foreign powers over to the states, and then they would try to take over. If they were able to help in any way, then they're going to look for a repayment or a reprisal of their help. Now, he continues that some states may not be able to pay these exorbitant duties, and I quote, "There is perhaps nothing more likely to disturb the tranquility of nations than their being bound to mutual contributions for any common object that does not yield an equal and coincident benefit, for it is an observation as it is trite that there is nothing men differ so readily about as the payment of money," end quote. So here what he's saying is that there will be some, in terms of the amount that they get from this taxation, what they get in return from the government, it really is not worth it, and there's some states that'll end up paying way more for the taxation than other states will, and there's nothing that men are more willing to fight about than payments of money, is what he says here. And he continues, and I quote, "From the view they have exhibited of this part of the subject, this conclusion is to be drawn that America, if not connected at all or only by the feeble tie of a simple league, offensive and defensive, would, by the operation of such jarring alliances, be gradually entangled in all the pernicious labyrinths of European politics and war, and by the destructive contention of the parts into which she was divided, would be likely to become a prey to the artifices and machinations of powers equally the enemies of them all. Divide et impera must be the motto of every nation that either hates or fears us," end quote. What he's alluding to here is that America, because they don't have that strong federal government with an apparatus for taxation, they will invite these, they will start these alliances, which I've alluded to in past videos, these alliances from these European nations to start getting engaged in our politics and our battles within the states, and it's going to be destructive. And really, the divide et impera part at the very end is Latin for divide and conquer, which is going to be the motto of every single nation that hates or fears us, is what he says. So that's the best way to take America out, is you try to divide it into those multiple confederacies that we currently have without that unified government or that unified structure behind them. And that economic instability and these fights over land were really, worries of our government structure. We just did not have the government structure that was able to instill, like, there was an example, like I said before, between, it was Pennsylvania and I don't remember the other state, but they were fighting over land, which they called at that time Wyoming. I don't even know if it was actually Wyoming out in the Midwest Wyoming, or if it was just kind of like a Wisconsin, Michigan area and they called it Wyoming. I'm not exactly sure, because I think Wyoming was way bigger and then they kind of broke it up into different states. But they were fighting over it, and then it went to a court case, and they ended up giving it to Pennsylvania, and the other state was not happy about it, and it didn't really set that distinct standard. Hey, this is theirs, and you guys can't really do anything about it. And it also didn't really set that distinct standard on how to start new states, because what they could have done is they could have just added it and said, hey, this is a new sovereignty, this is a new state. And that would have really solved a lot of problems. And if they did that, and as long as they had their military set up, because that's really what it always comes back to. It always comes back to your military power and your military force. If you have that military set up and you say, hey, this is a new state, you guys can't do anything about it, what are you going to do? If you go try to take that state over, the federal government will jump in with their military and say, hey, you can't do this. You're part, you agreed upon the Constitution that you're not allowed to go and fight other states or have state disputes like this. We settle any issues in court, which is really, that's why it's important. The court system was very, very important to have. It was probably the most, even today, it's probably the most underrated system is our federal court system, because especially now they are supposed to be interpreting the law, and by doing so they do set a lot of standards and a lot of laws, and by case law they'll end up setting a lot of standards for law. So it is very underrated. Some would say it's overused, because they're supposed to protect, these judges are supposed to protect the constitutions, and a lot of them are activists, and they don't at all. They will just kind of take the law and they will interpret it in the way that their personal view could be supported by the law, instead of literally just looking at the law and deriving their opinion, or not even their opinion, but their judgment off of the law. And I differentiate that from opinion, because you can have a specific opinion about something and you should think, hey, it's supposed to be this, I think it's supposed to be this way, but then when you go and look at the law, if there's no justification for that, then you can't make that judgment. The judgment is supposed to be based off the Constitution or the law that they're looking at. I mean, if it's a state court, it's different, because there's a state constitution, as long as it doesn't fall within the realm of anything that's considered federal. by the standard of our federal constitution. They look at state constitutions for certain specific rules or actions, but if it has anything to do with, freedom of religion or Second Amendment or due process or unreasonable search and seizure, anything that is of the federal jurisdiction, then they're supposed to rule. Well, they rule on their state constitution, then it gets kicked up to the federal circuits, and then from the federal circuit courts of appeals, it gets kicked up to the Supreme Court eventually. And then the Supreme Court, you're supposed to rule on things like you are looking at the Constitution and you make judgments off the Constitution, but it seems like there's a lot of Supreme Court justices. I'm sure there's a lot of other justices around the nation, a lot of other judges that make their decisions based on their opinion rather than judgments or interpretations of what the Constitution really says. For example, there was Heller versus D.C. in 2008. And that case, really, there's no reason for it to even have a 5-4 vote. And it was confirming in favor of individual gun ownership. The 5-4 was in favor of it. And imagine there only took one vote going to the other side to take away the privileges. I don't even want to call it the privileges, the right of a law-abiding citizen to have the right to own a gun, the right to carry out the responsibility of protecting their family. So I don't know how you can read the Second Amendment, or you can even read the Constitution, and you can come to that conclusion that the government has the power to just take your right away from you that way. So that's going to be it for this paper here. I'm going to be going over the next one's going to be Federalist number 8, and then we're going to start rolling, because I know 9's are really it's much more significant, and 10 is one of the biggest ones that they talk about. 9 and 10 are both kind of on the same topic. One's written by Hamilton, the other one's written by Madison, so got some exciting stuff in the near future, and just stay tuned. I will see everyone on Wednesday. Make sure you like, share, subscribe. Drop the mic on anyone you know. It seems like I'm picking up steam on Rumble. I'm getting 2 or 3 subscribers every single day. Facebook, not Facebook, YouTube, I'm pretty much at a standstill. I don't really move anywhere because YouTube, to advertise with them is very, very exorbitant. It's expensive. So I don't really advertise with them. I don't really advertise with Rumble either, but I don't know what it is. They will advertise a lot of my stuff for me if I give them certain exclusive rights. So it seems like I'm picking up steam there. Maybe just the stuff that I say resonates more with that viewership over there on that platform. But yeah, so make sure you tune in on Wednesday. It's going to be releasing at 6:15 like it always does on YouTube, 6 o'clock on Rumble. Make sure you drop the mic on people. Let them know about the podcast. Let them know, hey, it's very informational. There's a lot of historical references if you like history. And that's it. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night, and I will see you on Wednesday.